Hello, and welcome to the Mythic Archive. Today we are going to do something different. We are not just going to tell a story. We are going to resurrect a world. Before there were knights in shining armor, before there were castles with high stone walls, and long before the English language as we know it even existed, there was a poem. It was sung in the mead halls of the Anglo-Saxons, whispered around fires in the winter darkness of the first millennium. It is the oldest surviving epic in British literature, but its heart belongs to Scandinavia. It is a story of kings and monsters, of gold and blood, and of the inevitable crushing weight of fate. This is the story of Beowulf. But to understand Beowulf, the hero, we must first understand the world that needed him. The poem does not begin with the man. It begins with a funeral. It begins with the word "Wyatt." Listen. It calls us to remember the spear Danes in days of yore and the kings who ruled them. It tells us of shield Sheafson. He was the founding father, the scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches. He began life as a foundling, a baby drifting alone on the sea, but he grew to be a king whom all neighboring tribes had to obey. He demanded tribute. He was a good king. When Shield died, his people did not bury him in the ground. They bore him to the water's edge. They placed him in the bosom of a ship, right by the mast. And they did not send him off empty-handed. They piled the deck with treasures from far-off lands, coats of mail, swords, and gold. It is said that no ship had ever been sailed so nobly. They set a golden standard high above his head, and they let the ocean take him. They gave him back to the sea that had brought him. The poet tells us that no man, no wise counselor in the hall, can say for certain who received that cargo. It is a reminder right at the start that life is a brief flash of light between two dark oceans of the unknown. Shield left behind a son, Beowulf, who ruled long and well, and Beowulf had a son, the great Halfdane. And Halfdane, fierce in battle, had 4 children, 3 sons, Heorot, Hrothgar, and Halga, and a daughter. And of these it was Hrothgar who was destined for greatness. Hrothgar was granted success in war. His friends and kinsmen obeyed him, and his army grew into a mighty band. It came into his mind that he would build a house, not just a house, but a hall. A mead hall larger than any the children of men had ever heard of. He wanted a place where he could share out everything God had given him to young and old alike. He gave the order, and workers from far and wide came to build it. It towered high and horn-gabled. He named it Heorot, the Hall of the Heart. Heorot was more than a building. It was the center of the universe for the Danes. It was light, warmth, and civilization in the middle of a cold, hostile dark. Inside Heorot, Hrothgar sat on his throne, dealing out rings and torque gold. The harp was struck. The scop, the bard, sang the stories of the beginning of men. He sang of the Almighty making the earth, a radiant plain encompassed by water. He sang of how the sun and moon were set as lights for land dwellers. The hall rang with laughter and the sound of happiness. The warriors feasted and slept, safe in their golden hall. They believed they had carved out a permanent space of order in a chaotic world, but they had forgotten that the light casts a shadow, and the louder they sang, the deeper that sound penetrated into the dark places of the earth. Out in the darkness, a grim demon was suffering. His name was Grendel. He was a prowler through the dark, a dweller in the marshes and the moors. He lived in a desolate land of fens and mist. The poet tells us exactly what he was. He was of the race of Cain. Since Cain killed his brother Abel, the eternal Lord had avenged that murder. From Cain awoke all evil broods, ogres, elves, and phantoms, and also the giants who fought against God. Grendel was an outcast, condemned to wander the outer darkness, cut off from the joy of men and the grace of God. And this is why he hated Heorot. It wasn't just that they were loud, it was that they were happy. Every time the harp struck a note, every time a warrior laughed, it was a physical reminder to Grendel of what he could never have. He nursed a hard grievance. He listened to the din coming from the high hall. He waited until evening came. When the sun set and the beer drinking was done, the warriors of the Danes fell asleep in the hall, unaware of sorrow. Grendel came. He descended from the misty peaks. He was grim and greedy, savage and cruel. He found the company of nobles sleeping after their feast. He did not hesitate. He snatched up 30 men, 30 warriors in one hand. He smashed them. He butchered them. And he ran back to his lair, dripping with blood, delighted with his night's slaughter. Dawn broke, and the reality of the horror was revealed. The laughter of the previous night was replaced by a mourning lament. Hrothgar, the great king, sat stricken and helpless, humiliated by the loss of his guards. He wept for his thanes. But it wasn't over. The very next night, Grendel returned. He committed even more murders. He felt no remorse. He was too deep in his sin. And this continued. Not for a week, not for a month, but for 12 winters. 12 long years, the great hall of Heorot stood empty at night. No one dared to sleep there. The greatest house on earth became a tomb. The story of Grendel's terror spread across the seas. It traveled via sailors and bards to foreign lands. It reached the land of the Geats in what is now Sweden. And it reached the ears of a young man who was stronger than any other man in this life. A thane of King Hygelac, a man named Beowulf. So Beowulf, the mightiest man on earth, high-born and powerful, ordered a boat that would ply the waves. He announced his plan to sail the Swan's Road to search out that king, the famous prince who needed defenders. He chose 14 of the bravest Geats he could find. They went down to the sea. The boat was on the water, under the cliffs. The warriors loaded their shining war gear, their mail shirts and weapons. The wind caught the sail, and the ship foamed at the neck, speeding over the waves like a bird until they saw the shining cliffs of Denmark. They landed, threw down their anchor, and thanked God for an easy crossing. But they were not met with a red carpet. They were met with a spear. On the ridge above the beach, the Danish Coast Guard, whose job it was to watch the sea cliffs, saw them. He saw shields glinting and war gear ready. Curiosity and duty pricked him. He rowed down to the shore, shaking his heavy spear in their faces. He demanded to know who they were. I love this moment because it shows the protocol of the age. You do not just walk into a foreign kingdom armed for war. The Coast Guard asked them who they were, why they came in armor, and if they were spies. He noted immediately that Beowulf was different. He said, "I have never seen a mightier man on earth than is one of you, that hero in armor. He is no mere hanger-on in a troop, unless his looks belie him." Beowulf answered him with the oldest form of passport in history. He gave his lineage. He identified his father, Ethiau, and his king, Hygelac. He stated his mission plainly. He had come to help Hrothgar defeat the monster. The Coast Guard, impressed by his words and his bearing, allowed them to pass. He even promised to have his own men guard their ship. He pointed them toward the great hall. The Geats marched inland. Their armor rang as they walked. They arrived at Heorot, the gold-roofed hall that shone over many lands. They were welcomed by Hrothgar. The old king was relieved but also weary. He recognized Beowulf not just as a hero, but as the son of an old friend. Hrothgar had once paid a blood debt for Beowulf's father, saving him from a feud. So Beowulf was here not just for glory, but to repay a family debt. A feast was held. The mead flowed. But not everyone was happy. There is always one character in these stories who represents jealousy, and here his name is Unferth. Unferth was a courtier of Hrothgar. He was drunk, and he was sick with envy. He could not stand the idea that any other man on earth could care more for glory than himself. He stood up in the hall and challenged Beowulf. "Are you that Beowulf," he sneered, "who took on Breca in a swimming match on the open sea? You swam for 7 nights, risking your lives for pride, and in the end, Breca beat you. He was stronger. If you couldn't beat Breca in a swimming race, how do you expect to last a night against Grendel?" This is a crucial scene. It is a verbal duel, a flighting, which is like an ancient rap battle. Beowulf had to win this argument to prove he was worthy of the physical battle to come. Beowulf remained calm. He took a drink. "Well, friend Unferth," he said, "you have had a lot to say, mostly because you are drunk on beer." Beowulf then corrected the record. He explained that he and Breca were young and foolish. Yes, they swam for 5 nights in the freezing winter ocean, holding swords to protect themselves from whales, but they were separated by a storm. Beowulf did not lose. He was attacked. He was dragged to the bottom of the sea by sea monsters. He fought them off. He killed 9 sea beasts with his sword. In the morning he washed ashore, alive. He didn't lose the race. He survived a massacre. And then Beowulf delivered the killing blow to Unferth's pride. He said, "I have never heard such tales of bravery about you, Unferth. In fact, if you were half as brave as you claim, Grendel would never have been able to terrorize this hall. But he knows he has nothing to fear from your blade." Unferth sat down, silenced. The queen, Wealhtheow, was pleased. She offered the cup to Beowulf. The hero made his formal boast. He would not use a sword against Grendel. Since the monster used no weapons, Beowulf would fight him with his bare hands. It would be a trial of pure strength. Night fell. Hrothgar and the Danes left the hall to sleep elsewhere, leaving it to the Geats. Beowulf removed his iron mail, his helmet, and his sword. He lay down on his bench and waited. The other Geats fell asleep, but Beowulf watched. Then, coming out of the moors, under the mist hills, Grendel walked. The monster ripped open the iron-bound door of the hall with a touch. He saw the sleeping warriors. His heart laughed. He intended to tear the life from their bodies before morning. He grabbed the first sleeping Geat, a man named Hansio. He bit into his bone lappings, bolted down his blood, and gorged on him in lumps. He ate him, hands and feet. Then he stepped towards the next man. He reached out his claw towards Beowulf, but Beowulf was ready. As the claw came down, Beowulf raised his own hand and caught it. He locked his fingers around the monster's arm. Grendel stopped. In that instant, the monster realized the truth. He had never met a man with a grip like this. It was harder than iron. It was the grip of a hero with the strength of 30 men. Grendel was no longer hungry. He was terrified. His only thought was to flee, to get back to his fen. But Beowulf would not let go. They wrestled. The hall clattered and shook. The gold-adorned benches were ripped from the floor. The beautiful building groaned but held. Outside, the Danes heard the screams and shrieked in terror. But it was not the Geats screaming. It was the monster. Grendel pulled, Beowulf pulled back. The sinews snapped, the bone burst. With a sickening tear, Grendel's entire arm from the shoulder down was ripped from his body. The monster fled into the night, bleeding to death, leaving his arm behind. Beowulf stood victorious. He hung the bloody arm, claw and all, from the high roof of the hall. It was the trophy of the first victory. Heorot was cleansed, but the Geats did not know that Grendel was not alone. He had a mother, and she was listening. The morning after the fight was a time of celebration. The Danes marveled at the giant arm hanging from the roof. They traced the tracks of the monster to the edge of the bloody mere where he had died. They declared Beowulf the greatest hero of the age. King Hrothgar adopted Beowulf in his heart as a son. He showered the Geats with gifts. He gave Beowulf an embroidered banner, a breast-mail, a helmet, and a sword. He gave him 8 horses with golden bridles. This was the concept of ring-giving, the glue that held Germanic society together. A king must be a ring-giver to secure loyalty, but the most significant moment of the feast came from the queen, Wealhtheow. She moved through the hall with dignity. She offered the cup to the king and then to Beowulf. She presented him with a torque of gold, one of the most famous treasures in northern mythology. Her speech is beautiful and tragic. She asks Beowulf to be kind to her sons. She is trying to secure their future, fearing that after Hrothgar dies, the kingdom might fall into chaos. She sees Beowulf as a protector. It is a poignant moment because we know from other sources that her fears were justified. The hall was filled with wine and joy. The warriors pushed back the benches and spread out their beds and bolsters on the floor, just as they used to do before the terror began. They placed their shields at their heads and their spears and helmets on the benches. They were ready for sleep, confident that the evil was purged. They did not know that safety is an illusion in this world. The poet tells us that an avenger survived the troll. Grendel's mother. She is a fascinating figure. She is described as a monstrous hell bride, forced to live in the cold currents of the lake. But unlike her son, who killed for fun or out of jealousy, she kills for duty. She is motivated by the blood feud. Her son was murdered, and by the laws of the time, she has the right, even the obligation, to exact a price. She came to Heorot in the dead of night. She was not as strong as Grendel, but she was desperate and furious. She burst into the hall. The warriors grabbed their swords, but they had no time to don their helmets. She was in a panic to get out alive, but she achieved her goal. She seized one man, just one. But she chose carefully. She took Essera. He was Hrothgar's soulmate, his mentor, his right-hand man, the dearest of all his friends. It was a surgical strike at the king's heart. And before she fled, she snatched down the bloody hand of Grendel from the roof. She took back her son's arm. She fled into the fens. Beowulf was not there. He had been given separate lodgings that night. When he arrived in the morning, he found Hrothgar devastated. The old king's speech here is one of the most moving in the poem. He mourns Essera not just as a warrior, but as a thinking partner. He was my shoulder companion, Hrothgar says. He begs Beowulf for one more favor. He tells him of the place where the monsters live. Hrothgar describes the haunted mere. It is a place of nightmares. It is a lake where the water burns at night. Trees with snake-like roots overshadow it. It is so evil that a deer chased by hounds would rather die on the bank than jump into the water to escape. Beowulf, the stoic hero, replies with words that define the warrior code. "Wise sir, do not grieve. It is always better to avenge dear ones than to indulge in mourning. Let us go." They rode to the swamp. They followed the tracks of the troll dam. The path was narrow and treacherous, infested with nicors and sea beasts. They arrived at the cliff edge and saw a horrific sight. The water was boiling with blood, and there on the cliff lay the severed head of a Sheafson. The lake was full of reptiles and sea dragons. Beowulf dressed for battle. He put on his fine webbed mail, which no sword could pierce. He put on his helmet, adorned with boar shapes to guard his life. And then an unexpected ally stepped forward, Unferth, the man who had mocked him. Unferth saw Beowulf's courage and realized his own cowardice. He offered Beowulf his own sword. It was an ancient heirloom named Hrunting. It was an iron blade, annealed in venom and tempered in blood. It had never failed anyone who used it in battle. Beowulf accepted the gift. He made a final speech to Hrothgar. "If I die, take care of my men and send my treasure to my king, Hygelac." And then, without waiting for an answer, the prince of the Geats plunged into the swirling water. It took him the best part of a day just to reach the bottom. The poem tells us it took the best part of a day for Beowulf to spot the bottom of the lake. That is how deep the corruption went. As soon as he neared the mud, the wolf of the deep sensed him. She welcomed him with claws. She grabbed the hero in a grip that was terrifyingly strong, but his chainmail held. She dragged him down, past strange sea beasts that tore at his mail with their tusks, into her lair. Suddenly, Beowulf found himself in a battle hall. It was an underwater cave, but somehow it was dry. There was no water to weigh him down, and a strange firelight cast a glow over the walls. He realized where he was. He was in the monster's house. Beowulf did not hesitate. He swung his sword, Hrunting, with all his might against her head. The blade rang out, a singing note of battle. But then disaster struck. The sword, which had never failed any man, failed him now. The edge turned flat against her skull. It could not bite. The mother was immune to the weapons of men. Beowulf threw the useless sword aside in a fury. He trusted in his own strength, the grip of his hand. He grabbed the monster by the shoulder and threw her to the floor. But she was not Grendel. She was faster, and she was fighting on her own ground. She grappled with him, and the strongest man on earth stumbled and fell. She pounced, she sat on her guest. She drew a dagger, broad and bright-edged, to avenge her son. She stabbed him. This is the moment where the hero should have died. But his mesh armor, the war net woven by Welland the smith, saved his life. The blade could not pierce the rings. Beowulf heaved her off. He stood up again, but he was weaponless, and he was losing. Then he saw it. Hanging on the wall of the cave was a sword. It was an ancient heirloom from the days of the giants, an Ealdsward Eotinisk. It was a weapon so huge and heavy that no ordinary man could lift it in battle. It was a weapon forged by the enemies of God. Beowulf, desperate and driven by adrenaline, seized the chain hilt. He drew the ring-marked blade. He swung it with all his remaining strength. The giant sword caught her by the neck. It sliced through her spine. The blade went all the way through. She fell to the floor. The wolf of the deep was dead. And then a miracle happened. A brilliant light shone in the cave, as bright as the sun in the sky. The evil was purged. Beowulf looked around the lair. He found the corpse of Grendel, lying dead from the wound Beowulf had given him in Heorot. In a final act of vengeance, Beowulf cut off the monster's head. But the blood of the monsters was so hot, so poisonous, that it reacted with the giant's sword. The blade began to melt. It dissolved like ice in the spring thaw, dripping away until Beowulf was left holding nothing but the golden hilt. He looked at the treasures in the cave, piles of ancient gold, but he took nothing. He took only the hilt of the giant sword and the severed head of Grendel. He swam back up through the water. Up on the cliff, the Danes had given up hope. They saw blood bubbling up to the surface of the lake and assumed Beowulf was dead. Hrothgar and his men went home, but the Geats stayed. They sat and stared at the water, sick at heart, wishing but not expecting to see their lord again. And then he surfaced. The hero returned. It took 4 men to carry Grendel's head back to Heorot on a spear. They marched into the hall where the Danes were drinking. It was a scene of triumph. Beowulf presented the hilt and the head to Hrothgar. Hrothgar gazed at the hilt. On it was engraved the origin of the ancient strife, when the flood destroyed the race of giants. And then Hrothgar, the old wise king, spoke. He did not just praise Beowulf, he gave a speech that is the moral center of the entire poem. It is known as Hrothgar's sermon. He warned Beowulf about the dangers of power. He told the story of King Heorot, a king who had great strength but a dark heart, who killed his own table companions and died alone. Hrothgar looked at the young, invincible hero and said, "O flower of warriors, beware of that trap. Choose the better part, eternal rewards. Do not give way to pride. For a brief while your strength is in bloom, but it fades quickly. Soon there will come sickness, or the edge of a sword, or the fire's fang, or the surge of the flood, or mere old age. Death will dim your eyes." It was a warning. You are strong now, Beowulf. But you will not always be. You have conquered the monster. Now you must conquer yourself. Beowulf prepared to leave Denmark. The parting between the old king Hrothgar and the young hero is one of the most tender moments in the poem. Hrothgar, who had seen so much death, burst into tears. He hugged Beowulf by the neck. The poet tells us that Hrothgar loved Beowulf so much that he could not hold back his sobbing. He knew in his heart that he would never see the boy again. It is a stark contrast between the wisdom of age, which knows the fragility of life, and the confidence of youth, which believes it is immortal. Beowulf sailed back to Geatland, his ship laden with treasures, horses, and armor. He returned to the court of his uncle, King Hygelac. And here we see a side of Beowulf that is often ignored. He is not just a brute. He is a statesman. He sat down with Hygelac and recounted his adventures. But he also offered a prophecy. He told Hygelac about Hrothgar's daughter, Freyawaru, who was betrothed to a prince of the Heathobards to end a blood feud. Beowulf predicted that the marriage would fail. He said that the spear is not easily silenced by a wedding vow. He understood the politics of his world perfectly. He then presented Hygelac with almost all the treasures he had won. He gave the golden torque to Hygelac's wife, Hygd. This was the act of a loyal thane. He did not hoard his wealth. He strengthened the bonds of his society, and in return, Hygelac gave him a sword, a hall, and 7,000 hides of land. Beowulf was now a great lord, but peace in the Germanic world never lasts. The poem flashes forward in a dizzying rush of history. We learn that King Hygelac, a real historical figure, died in a raid against the Frisians. Beowulf survived that disaster in a superhuman way. The text says he swam back to Geatland across the open ocean, carrying 30 suits of chainmail on his arm. He was offered the throne by the widow Queen Hygd, who feared her son Heorot was too young to defend the kingdom. But Beowulf refused. He honored the line of succession. He supported the young king Heorot. But when Heorot was killed in a feud with the Swedes, the mantle finally fell to him. Beowulf became king of the Geats. He ruled well for 50 winters. He was a wise king, an old king, the guardian of his people. And then one day a slave stole a cup. This is the incident that triggers the end of the world for the Geats. A runaway slave, fleeing from a harsh master, stumbled upon a hidden path. He found an ancient stone barrow, an earth hall near the sea. He entered it, seeking shelter. Inside, he found a treasure hoard from a forgotten race of men. The last survivor of that ancient race had buried the gold there, delivering a heartbreaking speech to the earth, asking the ground to hold what men could not. And then, a dragon had found it. For 300 years, the dragon had slept on the gold. Dragons in this mythology are hoarders. They gather treasure not to spend it, but to sit on it. They represent greed, stagnation, and useless wealth. The slave was terrified. He saw the sleeping beast, but he also saw a golden goblet. He reasoned that if he brought this cup back to his master, he might buy his forgiveness. His hand trembled. He reached out, he took the cup, and he ran. The stone rattled. The dragon stirred. It woke up. It sniffed the air. It smelled a human. It slithered over its hoard and realized that a single cup was missing. Its rage was instantaneous and absolute. It did not hunt the slave. It declared war on the country. It waited until evening came. When the sun set, the dragon rose. It was a creature of fire and air. It flew over the land of the Geats, vomiting flames. It burned the bright dwellings of men. It burned the gift throne of the Geats. It even burned down Beowulf's own royal hall. The sky was on fire. Beowulf was told the news. His own home, the throne room of the Geats, had been melted. This hit him hard. For the first time in his life, Beowulf felt anxiety. He wondered if he had angered the Almighty. He felt a dark gloom in his heart. But he was still a warrior. He commanded an iron shield to be made. He knew that a wooden shield, linden wood, would be useless against dragon fire. He refused to bring an army. He had defeated Grendel alone. He had defeated the mother alone. He was too proud to line up a host against a sky-born foe. He gathered 11 chosen warriors, and he found the slave who stole the cup. He forced the 13th man, the thief, to lead them to the barrow. They arrived at the cliff top near the sea. Beowulf sat down on the headland. He was old now. His strength was still there, but his spirit was heavy. He sensed his death was near. He spoke to his men. He recounted his life, his battles, the intricate politics of the Swedish wars, and the accidental death of his kinsman. It is the speech of a man reviewing his legacy. He stood up. He made his final boast. I risked my life often when I was young. Now I am old, but as king of the people, I shall pursue this fight for the glory of winning. If the evil one will only abandon his earth hall and face me in the open. He ordered his men to wait on the barrow. This fight is not yours, he said. It is mine alone. He strode forward, shouting a challenge into the cave. The dragon heard a human voice. It let out a blast of burning gas. The earth rumbled. The keeper of the hoard was coming out to fight. The dragon erupted from the barrow. It didn't wait. It breathed a stream of fire that was hundreds of feet long. Beowulf raised his iron shield, but the heat was unimaginable. He swung his sword, nagling, an ancient gray blade against the dragon's skull. But fate was cruel to Beowulf. His strength was too great. As he struck, the sword snapped. It shattered against the dragon's scales. Beowulf was disarmed. He was wrapped in flame. And then, the most shameful moment in Geatish history occurred. The 10 hand-picked warriors, the best of the Geats, the men who had boasted in the mead hall about how they would repay their king's gifts, they ran. They fled into the woods to save their lives. They abandoned their king to die alone, all except one, a young man named Wiglaf, son of Weohstan. He saw his lord suffering under the heat under his helmet. He remembered the gifts Beowulf had given him. He could not bear it. He shouted at the cowards fleeing into the trees, "I would rather my body were robed in the same burning gleam as my gold giver's body than go home bearing arms without him." He waded into the smoke. "Go on, dear Beowulf," he cried. "Do everything you said you would when you were young. I shall stand by you." The dragon attacked a third time. It rushed them. It clamped its fangs into Beowulf's neck. The king's lifeblood gushed out in waves. But Wiglaf did not panic. He didn't strike the head. He struck lower. He drove his sword into the dragon's soft belly. The fire began to fade. The king, still conscious, pulled a knife from his belt. And with his last remaining strength, Beowulf slit the dragon's flank open. They had felled the foe. They had killed the dragon. But the wound in Beowulf's neck began to burn and swell. He realized it was poison. He knew his time was up. He sat on a seat by the wall. He asked Wiglaf to bring out the treasure. He wanted to see what he had died for. Wiglaf brought out the hoard. Gold, cups, ancient rusty helmets. Beowulf gazed at the gold. He thanked the Lord of all for allowing him to win this treasure for his people before he died. He told Wiglaf, "You are the last of us, the last of the Wigmundings. Fate has swept our race away. I must follow them." He took the golden collar from his neck and gave it to the young warrior. He told him to build a barrow on the headland so sailors could see it from afar and call it Beowulf's Barrow. And then the old king's soul left his body. Beowulf was dead. The 10 cowards came back from the woods, ashamed. Wiglaf looked at them with pure contempt. He told them that they were disgraced and that death would be better for them than a life of shame. He predicted that once the world heard that Beowulf was dead and his men were cowards, the enemies of the Geats, the Swedes and the Frisians, would attack, and they would destroy them all. They built the pyre. They hung it with helmets and shields. They laid the famous prince in the middle. They lit the fire. The smoke roared. And then the poet gives us one of the most chilling images in literature. A Geatish woman, unnamed, sang a dirge. She sang of her fears. She sang of nightmare and lament, of her nation invaded, of enemies on the rampage, of bodies in piles, of slavery and abasement. She knew that Beowulf was the only thing holding back the dark. With him gone, the Geats were doomed. They built the barrow, and the gold, the dragon's hoard, they buried it with him. They put it back in the ground, as useless to men now as it ever was. 12 warriors rode around the tomb, chanting their dirge. They said he was, of all the kings in the world, the mildest of men and the kindest, the gentlest to his people, and the most eager for fame. Lofgjornost. And so ends the story of Beowulf. Not with a victory parade, but with a warning. Monsters can be killed, but time and fate conquer us all.